So, 5 other principles. A. Authenticity. Though the principle of abstraction promotes a presumption of liberty, understood in the way just described, it does not discriminate among liberties by ranking some as more basic or fundamental than others, except so far as some particular constraints might be shown to be especially destructive of the flexibility that abstraction aims to secure. It is an interesting question how far the liberties we intuitively consider to be fundamental might be identified and protected by the principle of abstraction in that way. I see no reason, a priori, for any great confidence that they could be. The project would be threatened by the contingency of preferences I described earlier as a problem of the interest strategy. The principle of abstraction is qualified, moreover, by a general exception. It recognizes that constraints might be necessary to protect security. An adequate conception of liberty picks out some liberties as stronger than others in the contemplated contest between liberty and the protection of person or property, and promotes these as particularly powerful rights. It insists that a stronger case is needed to justify a prohibition against speech than to justify a prohibition against assault, for example. Lawyers often use the familiar clear and present danger slogan to suggest the stronger case that is required. We must therefore consider whether the breach strategy produces other principles, beyond the principle of abstraction, that establish more distinct rights to freedom of choice. We are studying only the rights to liberty that flow from the view equality of resources takes of equality in private ownership, and, as I warned earlier, we must not suppose that these exhaust the rights that a more general account of equality of resources, which includes its theory of democracy, would support. But the group of rights that flow from equality in private ownership does include more powerful principles, though principles narrower in scope than the general principle of abstraction. Any auction scheme approved by equality of resources requires, for example, some baseline principles specially protecting the parties' freedom to engage in activities crucial to forming and reviewing the convictions, commitments, associations, projects, and tastes that they bring to the auction and, after the auction, to the various decisions about production and trade that will reform and redistribute their initial holdings. Once again, a dramatic example is available. Suppose the auctioneer, noticing that most parties to the auction would prefer the distribution that would then result, brainwashes a small minority out of their present tastes, which, if they remained, would make certain resources especially expensive for the majority. The resulting distribution, of course, satisfies the envy test, but can hardly be defended as showing equal concern for the parties for whom the auctioneer is initially responsible. Of course, most of the constraints on freedom of religion or speech or association we deplore are not cases of brainwashing. I point to this dramatic example only to make plain why equality of resources needs an account of authenticity that respects the abstract imperative of equal concern. Personality is not fixed. People's convictions and preferences change and can be influenced or manipulated. A complete account of equality of resources must therefore include, as a baseline feature, some description of the circumstances in which people's personalities will be taken as properly developed so that auction calculations can proceed. The baseline needs, that is, some principle defining authenticity. I use authenticity in a special sense. Personalities are authentic for our purposes when they have been formed under circumstances appropriate to using an auction among personalities so formed as a test of distributive equality. Of course, this is a very different idea from the idea of metaphysical or even psychological authenticity. It focuses, for one thing, on the absence of legal constraints, and most personality-forming constraints and other influences are, at least for us, cultural rather than legal. But for a special purpose, which is to explore how government treats people as equals, the special concern with legal constraint is legitimate. It cannot be silent on the question of authenticity, nor, of course, can it remit that question in some way to the action itself. We must choose between different available principles, once again, through the breach strategy. Difficult questions arise, of course, about the proper formulation of a principle of authenticity and about the precise limits of the activities a properly formulated principle might be thought to protect. But any acceptable principle must have a certain range. Je suis française aussi. Je vous explique. Je suis en train de lire l'œuvre English. What? The topic is Dworkin. I'm reading Sovereign Virtue by Dworkin because it is at the program of l'agrégation. Ouais, chelou lui. L'agrégation in France of philosophy. À l'oral. I don't know how you say this in English. The second part of the contests of l'agrégation of philosophy. Maybe you're in the wrong place. Thank you. And I know some candidates at l'agrégation listen to my audiobooks. Thank you. Merci. En même temps, ça fait quand même... J'ai 23 ans et j'en fais depuis que j'ai 6 ans. Ouais. Authenticity has both a passive and an active voice. Participants to the action would want both an opportunity to form and reflect on their own convictions, attachments, and projects, and an opportunity to influence the corresponding opinions of others, on which their own success in the action in large part depends. Non, je suis professeur de philo. So we would expect to find, within the broad dimensions of whatever principle of authenticity the breach strategy recommends, justification for affording special protection to freedom of religious commitment, freedom of expression, access to the widest available literature and other forms of art, freedom of personal, social, and intimate association, and also freedom of non-expression in the form of freedom for surveillance. In the artificial comprehensive action story, which in this and other ways assumes Marvel's heaven of world enough and time, the action would not commence until all parties wanted to exploit these opportunities no further. Ideal authenticity requires the fullest possible opportunity, not because people are always more likely to make wise choices with more time, but because their choices should not depend on a view of their personality, and of the personalities of others, with whose formation they remain dissatisfied. So the baseline of an ideal distribution would in principle allow to constrain, either before the initial action or after it, on opportunities to form, to reflect on, or to advocate convictions, attachments, or preferences. Authenticity would have to yield to security, no doubt, on dramatic occasions of emergency in the pre-action or post-action world, but the danger would have to be special, because any serious compromise of authenticity... On va laisser passer l'avion. Would impair the action or the equality-preserving power of post-action transactions in a particularly fundamental and pervasive way. Violations of the more general principle of abstraction distort prices away from true opportunity costs, but violations of the principle of authenticity are likely to distort prices more fundamentally, because they affect what people decide they want and therefore change the entire bidding program they decide to pursue. We have that special reason, within the structure of equality of resources, for insisting that authenticity be weighted more heavily than abstraction in any contest between these principles and the requirements of security, for insisting, for example, that free speech be protected except in the case of undeniable and overhanging danger. Authenticity does not supply the only argument of principle we need or have freedom of speech. And we have more practical arguments for free speech as well, arguments that emphasize the role of a free press in protecting against official corruption, for instance. But equality of resources would require a right of free speech just for authenticity, even if we had no other arguments for it. B. Independence. The principle of abstraction protects from criminal prosecution people who have unpopular moral or religious convictions, and the principle of correction does not undermine that protection. But unpopular people might suffer other disadvantages in the auction as we have so far defined its baseline. Suppose racists are sufficiently numerous that they can combine to buy tracts of land for housing from which they will thereafter exclude blacks. Nothing in the principle of abstraction forbids them to do so. Indeed, that latter principle might, in some circumstances, even argue for legally enforced segregation. The auctioneer might be persuaded that racists would combine to that end over a vast proportion of the community's residential land if organizational costs did not prevent this, and the principle of correction might then require him to anticipate that result by racial zoning in the baseline of the auction. But a political and economic system that allows prejudice to destroy some people's lives does not treat all members of the community with equal concern. So we need another baseline principle to ensure that the auction's results will not violate the abstract egalitarian principle in that way. The principle of independence speaks to both liberty and constraint. First, it checks the principle of correction by insisting that no baseline constraint can be justified as necessary to reach a result that would be reached in an auction with perfect knowledge and no organizational costs, if that result would be reached only because people's bids would reflect contempt or dislike for those who would be subject to or suffer disadvantage in virtue of the constraint. Next, it checks the principle of abstraction by endorsing baseline constraints necessary to protect people who are the objects of systematic prejudice from suffering any serious or pervasive disadvantage from that prejudice. In effect, the principle of independence redefines opportunity costs in that way. This argument might suggest that we have only an ad hoc case for the principle of independence, that we must design a special breach between the abstract egalitarian principle and the envy principle just to rule out segregation in an egalitarian distribution. That would, if true, be disappointing, because it would be better if no special additions to the basic structure of equality of resources were needed to rule out arrangements, like either de jure or socially coordinated segregation, that seem profoundly inegalitarian. We would hope, that is, to draw the principle of independence from the roots of our conception of equality. In fact, we can, because the problem of prejudice is actually an aspect of a more general problem equality of resources must face in a variety of contexts. The problem of handicaps, equality of resources is challenged by significant differences in talent, understood as the ability to produce goods or services others will pay to have, for example. Oui, je lis les livres pour l'agrégation de philo. In Chapter 2, as suggested, as one partial remedy, schemes of compensation based on hypothetical insurance markets. Tu passes l'agrégation? Prejudice, though obviously different from physical handicaps or lack of skills in any number of ways, is an example of a structurally related problem. Just as some people are at disadvantage because the tastes of others do not allow their services to command a premium in the market, so other people suffer because they belong to a race or have other physical or other qualities that a sizable number of their fellow citizens dislike or for some other reason wish to avoid. True, though equality of resources is neutral about the tastes that impose the disadvantage in the first case, it condemns the attitudes that create disadvantage in the second. But that difference means only that we have more reason to try to reduce the inequality that springs from prejudice than to try to reduce that from other sources. Compensation schemes based on hypothetical insurance markets, useful though they may be in ameliorating other forms of handicap, are plainly inappropriate in combating the effects of prejudice. Oh, pour l'instant, j'ai lu que contes. Et voilà, je suis en train de lire Dworkin. Si, j'ai lu les 3 lettres d'Épicure. Voilà. Et un livre de Bachelard. Paysage. Mais ça se trouve, on se connaît. C'est la première fois que tu prépares l'agrégation? Ou pas? Et avant, t'étais dans quelle formation? Parce que si t'étais à Henri IV ou à Sorbonne Université, ça se trouve, on s'est croisés. Alors. We must find some other way, compatible with the other goals and constraints of equality of resources, to place victims in a position as close as possible to that which they would occupy if prejudice did not exist. The principle of independence, with its negative and positive impact on the liberty constraint system of the egalitarian baseline, seems an appropriate means to choose. So that principle is not, after all, only an ad hoc patch on an isolated leak in equality of resources, but rather a consequence, in the context of prejudice, of a much more general feature of that conception of equality. Merci. Au lycée, d'accord, pas en prépa? Moi, je suis à Paris 4. Et t'as déjà le CAPES ou tu prépares aussi le CAPES? Ou le CAFEP? Moi, j'ai préparé les deux l'an dernier, je les ai pas eus. J'étais à 0,5 points de l'admissibilité au CAPES sur 20. J'étais dégoûtée parce que j'ai eu 13 au commentaire, mais j'ai complètement foiré la 17. Ce qui a fait 9 de moyenne, et il fallait 9,5. Mais j'ai quand même pu être contractuelle là du 14 mai à fin juin, et là j'aurais eu 12 heures à la rentrée, notamment à l'EIB Étoile, qui est un super établissement, donc je suis super contente. C'est vraiment une des meilleures façons de préparer le CAPES et leur programme de la grecque, je pense, d'enseigner. Ce qui est très drôle, c'est qu'il y a quelqu'un qui suivait mes lives l'année dernière, en fait, qui était à Paris 1. Et on s'est croisés dans les couloirs de Paris 4 parce qu'il est allé à quelques cours à Paris 4. Et en fait, il vient seulement de se rendre compte que c'était moi. Ouais, merci. C'est très dur, hein, philo. J'ai une camarade qui est excellente, qui a été sous-admissible à l'ENS de Lyon, qui a eu 17 à son mémoire et tout. Elle n'a rien eu pareil l'année dernière, elle était loin en plus, au niveau des points. Et cette année, elle a été admissible au CAPES, c'est tout. Donc elle repasse encore une troisième fois les deux. Un autre qui a été admissible à l'ENS de Lyon, étudiant à Normal Sup Ulm, admissible à l'agrégation l'année dernière. Mais c'est tout. Le reste du temps, il a rien eu et ça va faire la 4e fois là qu'il va repasser. Six, back toward the real world. A, theory of improvement. We use fantasies in political philosophy to sharpen ideals, and we use ideals to choose among failures. To identify the least unjustifiable of practical possibilities. How can we use the fantasies of equality of resources, imagined in a world where everything can be auctioned and auctions can last forever, to choose between practical possibilities in our own world, where most things are already owned, almost no material resources are in anything like their most abstract form, and a comprehensive auction can scarcely even be described? Merci. No actual community, at least no complex community in which production and exchange takes place, can technically reach or sustain an ideal egalitarian distribution on the model of the imagined auction. Some shortfall is inevitable for two very different kinds of reasons. First, distribution is inevitably incomplete in the following way. The liberty constraint system explicitly established in legal rules and past judicial decisions does not decide all questions that arise about the rights people have to use their property in ways that conflict with the use others make of theirs. In Law's Empire, I tried to show how the civil law of negligence and nuisance can usefully be understood as responding to this problem by requiring private citizens to make adjustments to the standing liberty constraint system so as to carry forward, though in a necessarily imperfect way, the general scheme of equality of resources. See Law's Empire. Voilà. I shall not discuss this problem here. Second, distribution, even so far as it is complete, cannot wholly satisfy the envy test when people differ not only in personality but in productive ability, as they always do, or when people have different good and bad luck, as they inevitably do. We can, and equality therefore demands that we do, compensate for these differences in ability and luck in various ways. I tried to suggest, by constructing hypothetical insurance markets designed for that purpose, how we might hope to do so. But this compensation cannot wholly cure the disadvantage, so the envy test will continue to fail. I shall not discuss this problem any further here either. We need counterfactual speculation, and the argument so far should help. We need first to imagine an ideal distribution among us. Suppose people with our tastes and ambitions were somehow able to organize and execute an egalitarian auction of all the resources collectively at our command from a baseline that respected the principle of abstraction and the other principles we identified. What general distribution would result? Of course, it would be absurd to think that we could describe the outcome of such an auction with any precision. It would be impossible to say what each of us would now have, person by person, if such an auction had been held in our youths and we had produced, traded, and consumed from our immediate post-auction position ever since. But we can nevertheless make useful judgments about what our legal and economic structure would be like, and about what patterns of distribution of private property we would have developed. Our criminal law would protect and respect liberty in the form of the principle of abstraction and the other principles we discussed. Compensatory insurance schemes would be in place so that the unemployed or underemployed and the sick and handicapped would have special resources approaching those that people would provide for themselves in an equal insurance market. People would have different resources, occupations, and savings, but the great extremes of wealth and poverty familiar in most modern societies would not exist. We can form a picture of the consequences an auction would have produced among us, in other words, which, though vague, is sufficiently detailed to make us confident that our present legal system and our present distribution of private property are not within the set of arrangements that could have been produced by such an auction. We can also assign many members of the community to one of two classes: those whose circumstances are plainly better, as they would themselves judge, than they would be in any of the arrangements that might have been produced by an egalitarian auction, and those whose circumstances are plainly worse. Of course, a substantial number of people may not fall into either of these categories. Hello. A conception of equality is worthless unless it describes not only an ideal egalitarian distribution, but what counts as an egalitarian improvement in a patently unequal distribution. So our next assignment is to compose a theory of improvement that suits equality of resources and can act as a guide for making our own society more egalitarian than it is. We need terms of accounting, though these may seem strange in the context of political philosophy. We might define a person's equity deficit as the amount of or degree by which he has less than he would have, or is otherwise in worse circumstances than he would be, under an ideal egalitarian distribution in his community. Since we cannot discover exactly what any particular person would have had under such a distribution, judgments about equity deficit must be rough and mainly comparative. We would ordinarily feel justified, for example, in saying that a very poor person, whose prior decisions cannot account for any substantial part of his poverty, has a higher equity deficit than a more moderately poor person, and that people in our upper middle class have no equity deficit at all. The goal of a theory of improvement must be to reduce equity deficit. Several questions arise. How is equity deficit to be measured? As said, our judgments must be rough, person by person. But what finer judgments are these rough judgments trying to approximate? Suppose we knew exactly what resources a particular person would have acquired and retained in an ideal distribution. What test would we then use to determine his exact equity deficit now? Would this test allow us always to say of two people that one's equity deficit was either greater than or less than or exactly equal to the other's? Let us stipulate that a program improves equality only when it reduces the community's overall equity deficit. This must be some function, presumably, of the discrete equity deficits of its members. But what function? How shall we decide, that is, whether a political program has improved equality of resources if it has reduced the equity deficit of some people but increased the deficit of others? B. Degrees of inequality. Each conception of equality must have its own distinct theory of improvement, which must be consistent with its general account of ideal equality. If reducing equity deficit is to be the test of improvement, then the deficit must be measured in the same currency as the ideal. Equality of welfare must define equity deficit as welfare loss. Someone's equity deficit is fixed for that conception by subtracting his welfare level from the level he would enjoy were welfare equal. But equality of resources cannot use a welfare-based metric of equity deficit. That would introduce, as the right metric for improving equality, a standard that equality of resources rejects for defining it. Equality of resources must calculate equity deficit on the space of resource, in other words, rather than on the space of welfare. But we have discovered that someone's circumstances may be worse than they should be in two respects or dimensions. He may not have the resources he would have acquired in an egalitarian auction from a baseline consisting of the liberty constraint system actually enforced in his community. Or the baseline system actually enforced may itself be inappropriate to equality of resources. It may violate the principle of abstraction, for instance, or one or another of the more specific principles we encountered. Hello. Of course, someone's circumstances may be worse than they should be for both these reasons. The liberty system might be unfair, and he might have fewer resources than he would have in an egalitarian auction, even from that unfair system. Most poor people in the real world suffer from that twin injustice. So we need some further accounting distinctions. A person's resource deficit is the difference between the resources he has and those he would have acquired in an egalitarian auction from a fair baseline. Resource deficit can generally be monetized sufficiently accurately for a practical theory of improvement. Someone's resource deficit is the sum he would need to transform his resources into those he would have had under that auction. A person's liberty deficit, on the other hand, consists in the respects in which he is worse off, in addition to the respects captured in his resource deficit, because the liberty constraint system of his community is not what equality of resources requires. Some of the consequences of an unfair baseline, as the definition suggests, figure in resource deficit. I imagined earlier a baseline that prohibited dividing land into lots smaller than the size necessary for a football stadium. Some people, as I said, would have fewer resources in virtue of that baseline constraint than they would have had without it, and their resource deficit reflects that difference. But consider another constraint I imagined. No one is permitted to make satirical sculptures. We cannot measure the degree to which that constraint makes any particular person worse off wholly in financial terms. If we set aside the possibility of political bribes, no sum is sufficient to purchase, in the market, the legal right to do what the law prohibits. Nevertheless, someone who wants to make satirical sculptures has resources less valuable to him than equality of resources has promised, and that fact must be reflected somehow in any adequate account of his overall equity deficit. So we need a separate accounting for liberty deficit. Someone's liberty deficit, we might say, is the degree to which he is limited in what he is able to do or achieve by some constraint, compared with what he would have been able to do or achieve in the position defined for him by an ideal egalitarian distribution. Liberty deficit is therefore sensitive to other features of circumstance. Suppose a legal system stipulates, for example, that no one may acquire more than half the community's total supply of marble. There would be no such prohibition in the baseline of an ideal egalitarian distribution. It would be forbidden by the principle of abstraction. Nevertheless, the prohibition produces no liberty deficit in the real world, for under an ideal distribution no one would be rich enough to buy up more than half the marble. A law wholly prohibiting the acquisition or use of marble, on the other hand, plainly imposes liberty deficit on those who want to sculpt. They cannot lead lives they might well have led following an ideal distribution. We cannot, as I said, put a money figure on that deficit. We can nevertheless compare liberty deficits in various ways so long as they arise from different constraints. Imagine a fantasy world in which one person is forbidden by law to eat broccoli and another forbidden to read books. Though we have no precise metric for comparing the consequences of these prohibitions, the second is plainly much more serious and consequential than the first. It limits the activities and achievements of those subject to it to a vastly greater degree. When two people are subject to the same legitimate constraint, however, equality of resources can supply no metric, so far as I can see, for quantifying, even informally, the difference in the equity deficit created by that constraint for each. Of course, different people will suffer differently from any given prohibition. The marble using constraint would have been much more serious for Bernini than for me. But these are differences on the welfare space, and we could not deploy them in our accounting of equity deficit without allowing differences in taste, project, and ambition to affect distribution in the way equality of resources denies they should. We want an interpretation of liberty deficit that can guide a theory of improvement, and we cannot accept, within equality of resources, that equality would be improved by assigning more resources to Bernini than to me just because he suffers more from not being free to sculpt. Equality of resources leaves no basis for interpersonal comparison of liberty deficits rising from the same constraint. It does not follow that such liberty deficits are in some sense identical for everyone. Suppose two people suffer liberty deficits from the same illegitimate legal prohibition, but one has more and the other fewer ordinary resources, in money terms, than they would have in an ideal egalitarian distribution. It is tempting to say that the overall equity deficit of the poorer must be greater than that of the richer, because, imagine, their liberty deficit is identical and only the poorer has a resource deficit. But we have no more right to say that their liberty deficits are identical than that one is greater than the other. Both these judgments make sense only as out-of-place judgments about welfare. Two liberty deficits are incommensurate rather than identical, and that incommensurability, as in this example, will sometimes make overall equity deficits incommensurate as well. C. Overall gains in equality. Obviously, equality would be improved overall in an egalitarian community somehow achieved an ideal egalitarian distribution if the community actually held a successful comprehensive action, for example. But since that is never possible, we must consider that what to count as a limited or partial improvement in equality as a step in the right direction. We need an answer that is compatible with the general design of equality of resources, with the view that conception takes of how people are treated with equal concern. Consider this suggestion, for example. A program improves equality if it does not increase anyone's liberty deficit and does reduce the total resource deficit in the community, that is, the total sum that would be needed to erase everyone's resource deficit. Equality of resources cannot accept that test of improvement, because the test assumes that people are treated with equal concern when the resources each has are taken into account, in the same way in programs designed to maximize such resources. The test would be satisfied, for example, by a program that substantially injured a few people who were already among the poorest in order to make a great many people who are less poor, but still deprived, somewhat better off. That is utilitarian egalitarianism on the resource rather than the welfare space. It defines an ideal egalitarian distribution as whatever distribution maximizes the overall financial value of resources. Since equality of resources rejects the thesis as a general account of equality, it cannot accept it as defining equity improvements. But when we reject this aggregate resource deficit test for defining improvements in equality, and insist that any test for improvement must be sensitive to liberty as well as to resource deficit, we seriously reduce our options. We can certainly accept programs that produce dominating improvements in equality. I mean programs that reduce the equity deficit of some people without increasing the equity deficit, either resource or liberty deficit, or both, of anyone else. That is not the same thing as a Pareto improvement. Increasing a progressive income tax to finance a comprehensive welfare program, including adequate unemployment relief, would not produce a Pareto improvement, because it would leave the rich worse off. But it might well produce a dominating improvement in equality, because it imposes no new constraints on liberty and might make only those who would have no resource deficit, even after the new taxes, worse off. Even programs that do restrict liberty, in ways in which it would not be restricted after an ideal distribution, may produce dominating improvements, as we saw in the case of the imaginary anti-marble monopoly law. Even though they limit freedom, they leave no one worse off with respect to the value of that freedom than he would be in an ideal situation. So dominating improvements in equality are much easier to achieve, and are therefore of much greater practical importance than Pareto improvements. It would be a mistake to conclude from the argument so far, however, that only dominating improvements count as genuine improvements in equality. But we must take some care in describing genuine improvements that are not dominating, and any list will be incomplete, because non-dominating improvements must be generated by a process of proposal and inspection, not by any comprehensive and exhaustive formula. For example, if a program imposes no fresh liberty deficits and improves the resource position of the group with the largest resource deficit, it plainly improves equality even if other, less substantial resource deficits are increased, but perhaps only provided that no one's deficit loss is greater than the largest deficit gained to a member of that most disadvantaged class. Oh. If we accept that qualification, this version of Maximin is more guarded than Rawls's version, which counts any improvement in the situation of the worst-off group a gain in justice. We can no doubt construct similar, more or less untidy, descriptions of programs that would satisfy us as making an inegalitarian society somewhat less so. But there is a general and serious limit to what can count as an overall improvement under equality of resources. No program can count as producing an overall improvement if it adds new and significant constraints on liberty that impose substantial liberty deficits. For since resource and liberty deficits are incommensurate, there is no way to justify the claim that a program that gives more protein to the poor at the cost of their free speech is an overall gain in the degree to which the community treats all its members as equals. D. Defensible egalitarian distributions. Our theory of improvement allows us to imagine programs of redistribution, including compensatory insurance against unemployment, low wages, and bad luck, that are technically, as distinct from politically, possible for us, and that would bring our community closer to an ideal distribution. Can we imagine reaching a situation, through such schemes, such that no further technically possible change could bring us even closer to that ideal? Let us call situations of that sort defensible egalitarian distributions, to mark the fact that, though they do not realize perfect equality of resources, they are examples of the best we can manage even with the best political will. We can readily identify distributions that are not defensible because they can plainly be improved, according to our theory of improvement, in the direction of equality judged by opportunity costs. The distributional schemes now in place in the United States and Britain, haphazard and patchwork though they are, could plainly be improved by a more just tax system, for example, and by redistribution toward those at the bottom that would not impose fresh liberty deficits. Neither Britain nor the United States, nor, I believe, any other country, has yet achieved a defensible scheme of distribution. I assume that we can also identify the main features, at least, of a situation that would constitute a defensible egalitarian distribution for us. I assume, that is, that we can describe an economic system that is technically possible from our present position and defensible as not open to further plain improvements. But if we can identify any defensible distribution for us, we can undoubtedly identify several, each rather different from the others, because we can imagine our community embarking on very different programs of reform, each of which consisted in measures improving equality until no more such measures were available. It makes perfect sense to suppose that some of these programs would be as a whole better than others, because the defensible distribution they would in fact produce would come closer to an ideal distribution. Perhaps we could decide which was best of all in advance if we had perfect analytic power and perfect predictive information about the personalities of each member of the community. But of course we do not have that power and that predictive information, particularly since, as the auction story itself emphasizes, people's personalities and ambitions would change as any program tending toward equality unfolded. So even if we know, for example, that our community would use compensatory insurance mechanisms as part of any program of reform it undertook, we also know that these mechanisms might take a variety of forms, ranging from a state-administered national medical scheme to more conventional social insurance programs funded from tax revenues, and we cannot predict with great confidence which of these devices would prove most valuable given the opinions about risk and other matters people actually turned out to have. Nor could we predict which forms of commercial organization or transaction our community would develop in its search for equality, except by making dubious assumptions about the savings, investment, employment, collaboration, and consumption decisions people would be likely to make with and from the resources assigned to them as reform developed. Even a community thoroughly dedicated to equality of resources would have to proceed toward that ideal gradually through a series of political decisions, each of which was judged most reasonable at the time. These decisions would themselves limit what was technically feasible immediately thereafter, and so historical contingencies, including accidents about the order in which these decisions were made, would cumulatively restrict the set of initially available defensible distributions toward which any particular community converged. The process of seeking equality, in other words, would not be path-independent. The best we can do now, therefore, by way of identifying defensible distributions for our community, is to imagine a set of such schemes, each of which is technically feasible through a series of steps we might begin to take at once. So I shall hereafter speak of a defensible distribution, meaning a member of that set, rather than of the defensible distribution. We might nevertheless rank defensible distributions in various ways. I shall be particularly interested in one ranking. We might rank them in order of plausibility, in the order of the probability that our community, if it were converted to equality of resources, would achieve that distribution. If we did try to rank distributions in that way, we should have to speculate about the likelihood that we would turn out to have and retain the convictions, projects, tastes, and attachments a particular distribution assumes, that we would collectively judge the policies and devices necessary to reach that distribution to be reasonable under the circumstance, and that we would pursue these policies and devices in the order necessary to reach it. We could not hope, of course, to achieve a complete ranking of the plausibility of the defensible distributions we recognize. We could not hope to be able to decide, for each pair of them, either that one is more plausible than the other, or that they are equally plausible. Nevertheless, we could reasonably hope for an incomplete ranking of plausibility. We should be able to decide that some defensible distributions are much more plausible than others. I shall now defend one claim about all but the most implausible defensible distributions for us. No one would be forbidden by law in a defensible distribution to use his resources in whatever way he chooses, except in so far as necessary to protect security or to correct for different sorts of auction or market imperfections. Equality of resources, in defining its ideal distribution, insists that the principle of abstraction be strictly observed in any auction baseline and in the transactions and events of post-auction life. If any actual distribution in the real world did not reflect the principle of abstraction, as it would not if its criminal law forbade people to use their resources as they wished except on grounds of security or correction, then the distribution could presumably be improved in the direction of the ideal by steps that included removing all such constraints. It would not count as a defensible distribution, therefore, so long as it retained any constraint forbidden in the ideal. This claim will probably strike some readers as plainly wrong. In many countries, an unfair distribution of wealth allows rich people to buy much better medical care than poor people can. Suppose one country remedies this particular injustice by forbidding the private practice of medicine altogether. That is an improvement in equality, even though it has introduced a constraint that would not be permitted in an ideal egalitarian distribution, provided that the constraint imposes no new liberty deficit, as it would not if no one is thereby prevented from obtaining the medical care he could obtain with the resources he would have in an ideal distribution. But just removing that constraint would not be a further step toward equality, but a retrograde step away from it, back to the less egalitarian status quo ante. The fact does not contradict my assumption, however, which is that a community could always advance toward equality by a series of steps that include removing any constraints that the principle of abstraction condemns. The community just described could redistribute wealth generally and adopt, as part of that project, a generous program of tax-financed medical care. Then, as part of the same overall strategy, it could remove constraints on private medicine. That comprehensive change would plainly be an improvement, from the point of view of equality, over the position it had reached in my story, which left great inequality of wealth and ameliorated only the impact of that inequality on medical care. And it would also be an improvement, from that perspective, over a less comprehensive change that redistributed wealth and provided generous medical insurance but left in place the constraint forbidding private medicine. Permitting private transactions in medicine allows people to make their own choices about the relative value of immediate and therefore expensive medical care as against less immediate care and other goods. Permitting private medicine, therefore, makes distribution more sensitive to opportunity costs in the way equality of resources approves. So my assumption holds except when a community is technically, which does not include politically, incapable of advancing equality through general programs that include removing constraints objectionable to the principle of abstraction and imposing no new constraints of that sort. No doubt we could imagine, with sufficient ingenuity, communities in that technical position. But I believe it very unlikely that our own familiar communities would find themselves in that situation, and so I shall assume that in all but the most implausible defensible distributions, the liberties the principle of abstraction requires would be fully protected. 7. Liberty and injustice. A. The real world. We began our study of equality of resources in the ideal world of fantasy, of comprehensive and almost eternally drawn-out actions. We have now followed that study into the ideal real world, only somewhat less fantastic, where inequality survives and technical problems are formidable, but where people are nevertheless fully committed to making distribution more equal. We stayed in that world long enough to define improvements in equality and defensible egalitarian schemes, and to compose an incomplete ranking of the latter according to their plausibility. Now we move again toward reality, toward the real world in which political difficulties are, if anything, more menacing than technical ones. This is our world, the world in which we must train theory and conviction on practical politics. Je sais pas comment on prononce menacing. Anglais.
Menacing.
Menacing. Okay. So this is our world, the world in which we must train theory and conviction on practical politics. We can use the idea we formed in the ideal real world of a defensible distribution to judge our performance so far in the real world. We criticize ourselves, not because we have not achieved an ideal egalitarian distribution, as we might have done in some fantastic comprehensive action, but because we have not achieved, or even approached, a defensible distribution for us. We have not done even what we technically can to ameliorate distributional inequality. Our failures have been failures of will, imagination, and mainly justice. Citizens and officials who want to do more for equality face a vast variety of issues and problems. So issues is not the same thing as problems. We must now study one of these. Rich people in the United States and Britain are much better off and most poor people much worse off than equality of resources would permit. Wealth should and could be redistributed by a general program of reform, perhaps through higher taxation and improved social programs of familiar sorts, perhaps in more radical, original, and effective ways. But there are serious political limits to any such program. Indeed, effective reform seems more remote now, at least in those countries, than it has for some time. The unfair advantages of unjust wealth can be limited, however, through other, more feasible means. By prohibiting the rich from exploiting their wealth in certain directions, for example. That would require legal constraints, such as constraints on liberty of political activity, on private medicine, and on contracts of employment that deny people the freedom of choice that the principle of abstraction requires. No plausible defensible distribution, I just said, would contain such constraints. No such scheme would include laws prohibiting people from spending as much as they wished on political campaigns rather than on luxury electronics. None would prohibit people from buying expensive medicine rather than expensive holidays. None would make it impossible for bakers to agree to work long hours rather than watch football on television. Or rather, none would prohibit these decisions unless that was necessary in the interests of security or health, or, what is unlikely, for market-correcting purposes. Are constraints on liberty nevertheless justified in a society of very imperfect equality? Does equality of resources insist, even there, that abstraction must not be compromised? Or is limiting freedom of choice a legitimate means of improving equality in a very unequal society? We have finally returned to the examples of political controversy that I set out at the beginning. We are now able to study these examples in the right way, as cases testing not the standing of liberty in some ideal egalitarian fantasy, but how liberty is treated in a realistic theory of improvement fit for our own shabbier world. Some pages ago, I said that equality could be improved by programs that violate the principle of abstraction. Some readers who were persuaded by my earlier arguments might have been troubled by that observation. Earlier, I argued strenuously. Strenuously. Attendez. Avec acharnement. De comment... de politique, déjà. Et de comment mettre en place des systèmes économiques égalitaires, on va dire. Pas qu'économiques, aussi au niveau... En fait, ne pas compromettre la liberté, mais comment faire en sorte d'avoir des sociétés plus égalitaires, sans sacrifier la liberté. Et comment en fait ça va ensemble, liberté et égalité. Donc, I argued strenuously that the principle of abstraction is at the core of equality of resources, a crucial part of the baseline from which any version of the envy test must be applied. Donc par exemple, est-ce que l'égalité aussi, il se demande si l'égalité c'est l'égalité dans le bien-être, ou plutôt l'égalité dans les ressources matérielles. Là, le troisième chapitre que je lis, c'est la place de la liberté. Voilà. But once the layers of our argument have been distinguished, any sense of contradiction disappears. I argued, at the first stage of analysis, that we cannot identify an ideal egalitarian distribution, even in principle, except by supposing freedom of choice already in place. We cannot have perfect equality without the freedom that the breach version of the constitutive strategy endorses as baseline liberties. In the next stage of our argument, the ideal real state, we used the idea of an unattainable perfect equality to imagine defensible egalitarian distributions for our own community. I argued at that level that no plausible defensible distribution would permit constraints disapproved by the abstraction principle. Now we are in the real world, however, and our question is different. We are no longer considering whether constraints on liberty are required by perfect equality, or even whether they are required by equality as an ideal that could technically be realized by us. We assume that we already know what a defensible distribution would be, and that we do not have one. Now we ask whether constraints on freedom are a permissible means of bringing us closer to a defensible distribution, even though no such distribution would itself allow those constraints. Par exemple, si je traduis, c'est « Nous supposons que nous savons déjà ce qu'une distribution défendable serait, et qu'on n'en a pas une. Maintenant, nous demandons si des contraintes sur la liberté sont un moyen permissible, sont un moyen qu'on peut utiliser pour ramener, pour qu'on soit plus proche d'une distribution défendable, même si une telle distribution, aucune distribution qui ressemblerait à celle-là n'autoriserait en elle-même ces contraintes. Nevertheless, the suggestion I am now mooting, plaidoirie, ok. Pour laquelle je fais une plaidoirie. Donc, nevertheless, the suggestion I am now mooting, that constraints on liberty might be justified as promoting equality in the real world, donc que des contraintes sur la liberté puissent être justifiées pour promouvoir l'égalité dans le vrai monde, does seem backsliding in another way. Nous sommes retournés en arrière. It will be called comfort to those who love liberty to be told that equality demands liberty in some ideal world if they are also told that it may readily be sacrificed to equality here and now. For they will certainly be aware of a new and darker side of the constitutive strategy I have been promoting over the interest strategy that is more familiar in political philosophy. The interest strategy, if it is successful at all, allows liberties to be ranked in importance. Donc il faut que les libertés soient hiérarchisées en rang d'importance. It allows us to say that people do or would or should care more about freedom of conscience or speech or choice in sexual orientation than about other freedoms, so that these more fundamental freedoms, at least, should be protected even in the imperfect real world. The constitutive strategy, in contrast, seems more an all-or-nothing affair. Donc la stratégie constitutive, à l'inverse, semble plus un tout ou rien, une affaire de tout ou rien. Je ne sais pas. The Brit version I use does recommend that some liberties be given a special place as rights in the baseline of ideal equality. I sketched a constitutive argument for what I called the principle of authenticity, which gives freedom of speech that special place, for instance, qu'il est attaché à la liberté d'expression. But that special role is internal to the calculations of the ideal equality. It justifies only the claim that in ideal equality, a stronger argument from security is needed to limit freedom of speech than to limit other freedoms. It seems to provide no reason why any particular freedom should be immune from compromise when our goal is the much more modest aim of approaching a defensible distribution that we cannot, for political reasons, actually reach. The constitutive strategy, therefore, seems to leave all liberties equally vulnerable in our own political situation, where the shield of rights, undentable in the world of fantasy, turns to tin. That conclusion might drive some readers back to the interest strategy, but suppose the interest strategy cannot, after all, be successful in protecting our basic liberties in the real world, as I suggested it could not. Then those who are drawn to liberty will be tempted by a still more radical option. They may take a new and sharper look at the humanist ideal that accepts the abstract egalitarian principle, either as an absolute requirement of just government or as qualified only in ways not relevant to liberty. Perhaps we should, after all, try to find some value in liberty that leaves it at once independent of equality and also independent of the benefit it brings to particular lives. So a great deal turns on how equality of resources answers our new question. Can freedom properly be compromised in the real world as a means of reducing the inequality found there? Donc là, il va se demander si on peut sacrifier la liberté à l'égalité. B. The principle of victimization. We might reformulate our accounting concept of a liberty deficit in the following way. A liberty deficit is a loss of power, in virtue of legal constraint, to do or achieve something that one would have had power to do or achieve following a defensible distribution. A community victimizes one of its members, let us say, when it imposes a liberty deficit on him. Now we can identify a principle that any acceptable theory of improvement must contain, which I shall call the principle of victimization. The principle speaks to both sides of the liberty-equality equation. It denies that liberty is violated when no one is victimized, That is, when the value of the liberty citizens retain is at least as great as the value of the unconstrained freedom they would have had in a defensible distribution. How can a plausible conception of liberty require that anyone have more power than he would have if freedom of choice was unlimited and resources fairly distributed? But it also denies that equality can be improved when someone is victimized. How can equality be improved when the equity deficit imposed on some is incommensurate with the reduction of equity deficit for others? So the principle reconciles liberty and equality in the real world of practical and imperfect politics. Liberty, it insists, demands nothing but the freedom of genuine equality, and equality cannot be served by any outrage to liberty. The principle of victimization is incomplete as I just introduced it, however, because it does not identify the range of defensible distributions that must be consulted in applying it. Different versions of the principle are therefore available. The strongest requires that no one's position be made worse with respect to the value of any aspect of his liberty than it would be in whichever defensible distribution, no matter how implausible, would provide him the greatest value for that liberty. I shall test the principle in a weaker and more sensible form. I shall assume that it requires that no one's position be made worse, with respect to the liberty in question, than it would most likely have been in a defensible distribution. I assume, as I said, that we can rank defensible distributions in order of plausibility, and identify some set of such distributions as most plausible. If someone's position would be worse, in virtue of the legal constraint, that it would be in most members of the set of most plausible defensible distributions, then it is worse than it would most likely have been in such a distribution. This formulation of the principle of victimization is sufficient for my argument, though it could easily be improved. I ignore problems about the individuation of distributions, for example, though these strike me as manageable. Very different formulations might also be investigated. There is much to be said, for example, for taking the reference point to be the least favorable defensible distribution for the value of the liberty in question. I doubt that the discussion that follows in the texts would be different, however, if I had chosen that formulation to test. We may test this version of the victimization principle by applying it to our initial sample cases. Is anyone victimized, first, by limits on the amounts a single person can spend promoting a political candidate? No such limits would be imposed in any plausible defensible distribution. People would have as close to equal resources, judged by the opportunity cost test, as is technically possible, and each would be free to decide how much of his resources to spend addressing his fellow citizens rather than on other goods he might also want. Nevertheless, the limits on election expenses that the Supreme Court struck down in Buckley v. Valeo, had they gone into effect, would not have made the value of the freedom that remained less for anyone than the value of the unconstrained freedom we would have had in at least most plausible defensible distributions. For no one in a community that had reached defensible distribution could have the impact on political decisions, just in virtue of money spent in politics, that the rich can now have in the United States, or even the impact that the rich would still have had if the Supreme Court had left the legislation intact. Disposable wealth would be much more evenly distributed, and though some people would presumably choose to spend a high proportion of their wealth in politics, many others, some of differing political views, would be ready and able to spend a similar proportion of theirs in the same way. The law the Supreme Court struck down therefore victimized no one. This is the easiest of the examples I listed because the constraint in question is directly and exclusively financial. The proposal to outlaw private medicine raises more complex issues. I assume, once again, that no such constraint would be imposed in any plausible defensible distribution, though of course constraints designed to assure competence and safety would be. In Britain, only two groups can now afford private medicine: those who are, relative to others, very rich, and those who have jobs in industries whose unions have secured private health insurance, funded largely by the employer in collective bargaining. The proposed ban on private medicine would of course reduce the freedom of these groups. Would it make the value of their freedom, with respect to choice in medical care less than it would be under the most plausible defensible distributions? Consider two programs a defensible distribution might use for providing medical care. In the first, medicine is wholly private, but an adequate health insurance plan, funded through taxation and available to everyone, provides resources sufficient to pay for the care the average person would insure to provide for himself in a private insurance market. In the second, medical care is offered through something like the British National Health Service, which is financed, again through taxation, at a sufficient level to provide everyone who uses the service with that same degree of care, though people are left free to make their own arrangements with willing and competent private doctors and hospitals if they prefer. I doubt that either of these possibilities could be shown to be distinctly more plausible than the other, though nothing here turns on that assumption. Other possibilities might be equally likely, but they would then be sufficiently similar to these two to raise no independent issues. So I shall assume that these two descriptions constitute the set of most plausible defensible distributions. Let us also assume that the National Health Service, as it now stands in Britain, would not itself be improved as a result of abolishing private medicine. Under that assumption, would the value of people's liberty be less if private medicine were outlawed than it would be in both of the two defensible distributions I just described? We must compare the medical care now available under the National Health Service with the care that would be provided under these defensible distributions, and we must distinguish three heads of comparison. Would anyone receive better medical care in either defensible avoiding the long queues for treatment of non-life-threatening disease in the present health service? Would he have more choice among particular doctors and specialists, a choice he might well value for its own sake? The answer to one or another of these questions, and perhaps to all three, might well be yes. Perhaps if people had equal resources, they would all have better or speedier care, at prices they could afford, than is now offered by the health service. Perhaps they would have more choice of doctors and specialists whose services they could afford. Inspirez-vous de la France. If so, if any of these hypotheses is persuasive, then government would victimize people by outlawing private medicine and leaving only the National Health Service, as it now stands, in place. But the government may nevertheless abolish private medicine as part of a program in search of equality if it is willing and able, concurrently, to improve the National Health Service in whatever dimension it now fails the test we just constructed. It should, after all, be possible to provide that service with the level of resources a National Health Service, or a scheme of tax-funded insurance for private medicine, would have available to it under a defensible distribution of wealth, though to do this it would probably be necessary to tax more heavily many of those who now enjoy the benefits of private medicine. Nor does it follow that government may not, even without substantially improving the National Health Service, restrict freedom of choice in the provision of medical services in ways short of abolishing private medicine altogether. It seems highly likely, for example, that in the most plausible defensible distributions, no one would in fact be able to jump the queue for treatment of crippling, though non-life-threatening conditions. Therefore, government does not victimize anyone by limiting constraints designed only to forbid such queue jumping through private medicine now. We are considering, of course, only whether various constraints on freedom would victimize, not whether any of these is, overall, a good idea. So the victimization principle is valuable beyond its role in forbidding certain constraints on liberty in the real world. It helps point toward a more inclusive program of reform by identifying a package of measures in which constraints might figure that a government might legitimately adopt in pursuit of a defensible distribution of the community's resources. The example I drew from the Supreme Court's infamous Lochner decision, in which the court struck down a New York statute limiting the number of hours bakers might work a week, is complex in yet a different way. If I am right, it is a nice paradox that the Buckley decision, which many people think right, seems a much clearer mistake than the Lochner decision, which everyone agrees was wrong. Of course, the employee bakery firms were not victimized. It is hard to imagine plausible defensible distributions in which they would find people willing to work the hours they wanted at wages that would make such hours profitable for them. But perhaps the New York statute would have worked to the disadvantage of immigrants who were desperate enough for work to accept the terms the bakeries actually offered. It might have cost them their jobs, and so left them worse off with respect to the value of their liberty of contract than they would have been under any defensible distribution counting them as participants. If so, and if New York had made, or would make, no compensating arrangement for alleviating unemployment, the statute victimized them, and I suggest that we should accept the conclusion that follows on the scheme we are exploring. It is wrong in principle for the state to deny people the right to work on terms they are willing to accept, in order to improve the economic situation of workers generally, unless it provides unemployment compensation or other relief for those who cannot obtain employment on the stipulated terms, relief sufficient to make their circumstances plausibly as good as they would be if people held a job under the outlawed terms. Was Lochner therefore rightly decided after all? The Supreme Court gave much too short shrift to the arguments about health and safety from which I am presiding, and anyway does not appear to have been moved by the egalitarian considerations we are inspecting. Presending. Présumé, okay. But suppose the arguments from health and safety were indeed too speculative alone to justify a constraint on liberty that worked to the disadvantage of those already most severely disadvantaged. I would still think the Lochner decision wrong as a piece of constitutional interpretation, for reasons I developed elsewhere and will not restate here except summarily. For my account of constitutional interpretation, see Dworkin, Law's Empire, page 355 to 399. New York's action was not wrong if it was part of a more general program advancing its conception of equality without victimizing any person or section of its community. The Constitution cannot be understood as demanding that all parts of a social program interpreting a state conception of equality be adopted at once, nor as permitting the Supreme Court to impose one conception of distributional equality on other departments of government. The Constitution, in other words, treats social legislation of the form struck down in Lochner as a matter of policy, not principle. In the absence of any showing that New York had abandoned equal concern for those who would lose jobs under one stage of its program, the Court's decision was unjustifiable. C. Fundamental freedoms. We have now canvassed a variety of restrictions on freedom of choice, none of which would be found in any defensible distribution of resources, but each of which might nevertheless legitimately be imposed, at least as part of a larger program, to improve a distribution of resources that is far from defensible. But I began this section by describing a great and understandable fear, that though equality of resources protects liberty in some ideal world, it undermines it altogether in the actual world of our politics, because it puts all liberties, even those we deem fundamental, at risk in this way. We must therefore consider whether the principle of victimization sufficiently protects what we believe to be the most fundamental of our liberties. In all the examples just considered, the most direct consequence of some suggested constraint is to remove part, though not all, of the advantage someone gains over others just in virtue of economic power he would not have in any defensible distribution. In some of the examples, the constraint has other or more diffuse consequences as well, and we worried over these examples for that reason. The case is very different when the constraint wholly removes a general liberty of considerable importance to some people's lives, because the value of their freedom is then sharply reduced from what it would be under any plausible defensible distribution. If people for whom politics is important are forbidden to speak, under a genuine or more likely fancied argument that this will reduce the material resource deficit of those worst off, they are victimized, whether or not they themselves have more or fewer material resources than any defensible distribution would provide them. So equality of resources cannot be improved by that step. If homosexuals are forbidden sexual intimacy altogether, they are also victimized, again whether they are now rich or poor. So these fundamental liberties are not put in jeopardy by my argument here, even in a deeply inegalitarian society. On the contrary, the argument helps to show just why they are fundamental. Juste à dire géopardy. Péril. Eight. Looking back. What is the place of liberty in equality of resources? If my argument is mainly sound, that place is fundamental and secure. I rejected the interest strategy, which makes the role of liberty in a general scheme of justice contingent in one way or another on the convictions or preferences that people happen to have, or would have under specified conditions, or should have. The constitutive argument I described does not make liberty contingent in any such way. Though the outcome of the auction-like procedures equality of resources imagines is of course sensitive to the projects and convictions people bring to the auction, liberty is not part of that outcome, but is instead fixed in the baseline of any auction that equality of resources accepts. So my argument has not relied on any claim that most people think liberty more important than other aspects of their circumstances. Of course, many people do think liberty crucially important for their own lives, as I believe everyone should. Nor have I relied on any instrumental claims about the long-term consequences of protecting any particular liberty. The priority of liberty, under equality of resources, is established at a level that makes it independent of such considerations. Liberty is crucial to political justice because a community that does not protect the liberty of its members cannot treat them with equal concern on the best understanding of what that means. It belongs to our political culture not only that liberty is important, but that some liberties are more important than others. These more important liberties, we believe, deserve special protection in constitutional arrangements. My argument rejects the interest technique for identifying these more important liberties, which requires that they be shown to be liberties people all or in the aggregate specially value, or would specially value if they reflected upon them. Nevertheless, the constitutive argument does capture the intuition that some liberties are more important than others. The principle of authenticity, for example, argues that the freedoms it sponsors, like freedom of speech and conscience, are central because any compromise of those principles has particularly corrupting consequences for equality of resources. In the last section, when we designed and applied the principle of victimization, we found additional grounds for ranking some liberties as fundamental. We noticed that someone who wholly denied those liberties is particularly likely to be victimized in the real world of our own politics, no matter what his social or economic circumstances otherwise are. It is, of course, a further and difficult question, well beyond our project here, how these important rights should be protected in a constitutional structure. But equality of resources does provide a strong case that they should be protected in some way. I close by returning to an important matter I mentioned near the beginning. I worry that some readers would find my argument for liberty demeaning to that virtue, because my argument would seem to them to make liberty only instrumental or subordinate to equality, as though we cared for liberty only as a useful circumstance for achieving a fair distribution of resources. I made the following reply to that objection. My argument here encompasses no more than a compatibility claim. Liberty and equality cannot conflict as two fundamental political virtues, because equality cannot even be defined except by assuming liberty in place, and cannot be improved, even in the real world, by policies that compromise the value of liberty. That argument in itself makes no claim about the ground of liberty. It is entirely consistent with the claim that liberty is essential for other reasons quite independent of equality. It insists only that even if we had no other reason for protecting liberty, we would at least have that egalitarian reason. I can now, however, expand on a further reply I also made. The interest strategy assumes that liberty and equality are two conceptually distinct political virtues. If they are, then questions naturally arise about the connection between the two virtues and about the priority of one over the other in any case of conflict. I assume this part of the interest strategy's foundation, the conceptual independence of liberty and equality, when I argued that if the two virtues do conflict, equality must have priority. But the constitutive argument insists, on the contrary, that liberty and equality are not independent virtues, but aspects of the same ideal of political association, so that when we declare our faith in liberty, we are only affirming the form in which we embrace equality, only declaring, that is, what we mean by it. The breach strategy presupposes that liberty and equality are aspects of a single political virtue, because that strategy uses liberty to help define equality and, at a more abstract level, equality to help define liberty. I did not argue the straightforward instrumental claim that a general presumption of liberty is a formal requirement of any auction that satisfies the envy test. Indeed, as I emphasized, a general baseline scheme of illiberalism, in which people are permitted to do almost nothing with what they acquire in the auction, would satisfy the formal requirements of such an auction just as well. Liberalism is appropriate to equality of resources. I argued, not because it is formally necessary to a successful action, but because the liberal baseline expresses equality of resources interpretation of the abstract egalitarian principle better than any alternative baseline. The crucial notion of true opportunity costs lies at the intersection of what are traditionally regarded as egalitarian and liberal concerns. It unites the two because it assumes both that a system of private property treats people as equals when it secures them equal resources, judged by the true cost of those resources to others, and also that the true cost to others must be judged, so far as possible, by assuming a norm of liberty, by assuming, that is, that others would have been free to use the resources in question as they wished if these were theirs instead. Opportunity cost is a Janus-like idea. It looks toward equality with one face, toward liberty with the other, and fuses the two virtues. Of course, the integrity of liberty and equality holds, at least in that way, only for equality conceived as equality of resources. That is what I meant when I said that when we declare for liberty, we identify the sense in which we are egalitarian. Equality of resources is, we might say, an inherently liberal conception of equality. The other conceptions I described, which do not use opportunity costs as the metric of equality, must fall back on the riskier interest strategy to find liberty's place. So our argument has disclosed a further and intriguing contrast between equality of resources and these other interpretations of equality. The interest strategy, which other conceptions use, locates the worth of liberty entirely within individual lives, one by one. The constitutive strategy, distinctive to equality of resources, does not deny the importance of liberty within lives, but it hazards nothing on it. It appeals instead to the role liberty plays in fixing the overall character of a society, in redeeming its commitment to equal concern for all. So perhaps the constitutive strategy, so far from making liberty seem mean and instrumental, finally offers an account of that virtue that matches our enthusiasm for it. Ensuite, ce sera for political equality. Pages, c'est beaucoup. À toutes.